Hi guys, Rob here. It's been a very long time since I put out a video, so I thought I'd start back at the beginning, essentially, with building a miniature. I recently got hold of the Operation Red Veil box set from Corvus Belli. It's for their Infinity game. I used to play Infinity back in version 2, I think it was. Never really got into version 3, but I thought I'd pick up this box set just to see what it was all about and to see what the miniatures were like. And whilst I was at it, I figured I'd build one for you. So this is how they arrive. So you get a little baggie full of bits, all sorts of bits and pieces in here. There's the body, arm with a gun, and another arm and his leg. So what we'll do, we'll open this up and we'll see what we've got. So yeah, we've got the body, and they're nice miniatures, to be fair. They're well sculpted. They've obviously come out of brand new moulds because there's almost no mould lines to be found on them, which makes clean up incredibly easy. They are multi-part metal miniatures. If there's any interest, I will also do a how to build guide for plastic and resin miniatures as well. We also have on another little bit of sprue. We have the arm and the weapon, and we have the leg. Now when I'm building these, the first thing we'll need to do is clean up all the little bits. Right on there you can see there's sort of a little bit of metal sort of on the end of the leg, on his foot, and there's probably a few other bits and pieces around. There's a few mould lines, but they're very slight, almost impossible to see even with the naked eye, to be honest. I don't know if the camera will pick them up, but there's one sort of going across the back of his knee and sort of down across the back of his calf there. I don't know whether the camera will pick that up at all. Then obviously these will need clipping off the sort of the bit of sprue here and cleaning up. There's a few little bits sort of here and there where obviously they've put gates in the mould to allow air to escape from the mould when they're casting it. So let's get started. The tools I'm going to be using are a X-Acto knife, or in this case a kind of sort of surgical knife, Swan Morton. It's a 10A blade. To be honest, the blade you use is largely irrelevant as long as it's I prefer a flat one. Some people prefer the curved one. It's largely personal preference. This will be used mostly for cutting off small bits of metal and scraping along mould lines to get rid of the mould lines. Obviously I hope by now it goes without saying, but this is sharp. Be careful with it. Also a pair of side cutters. These are flat side cutters, so this edge is completely flat and this edge has got the sort of dent in it. The reason for that is that you want to be able to cut sort of close up against something without damaging whatever you're cutting against. So we'll start with the body. So the body isn't too bad. There's a little bit of metal down here. So we'll just nip that off. There's another one there, you can see if I just pull it out. There it is. So you can see you've got this bit of metal on the back of the coat, so that can come off as well. Normally they come off quite nicely. They're usually not connected particularly closely with anything actually on the model. They're just there to sort of allow air to escape when the metal's being poured into the mould. In my case, I'm also going to be clipping off the sort of tag on the bottom of his foot. This is normally where you would put it into a sort of slotted base or something along those lines. In my case, I've actually got some bases from Antonosity's workshop. I'm going to be mounting these on, so I'm just going to clip that off, and again get as close in as you can without sort of damaging the foot. Can be a bit tricky, and then just squeeze and eventually it'll come off and fly off somewhere into your room. So that leaves you with a sort of sort of kind of a rough bit, and you can clean up the edges of it. How much of that you want to clean up is up to you. You can go in there with a file. I use a fairly aggressive file for things like that, and basically just sort of file it down smooth. But that very much depends on how the model is actually going to sit on the base. Whether I don't know whether this guy is actually sort of sitting forwards on the base so his foot's up, or whether he's actually sitting back on the base. Judging by the way he's standing, I'm guessing that he's going to be forwards on the base, because his other leg's going to sort of go in there approximately. So yeah, it looks like he's going to be sort of standing forwards on the base like that. So in this case, it's going to be sort of the back leg is going to be on his tiptoes. So beyond that, there's not too much on here. There's the odd mould line here and there. We'll just grab those quickly. There's one in here. You'll need to spin the model around to get your knife in. With the mould lines, what you're aiming to do is you don't want to be sort of trying to gouge into the model, because that will just take chunks out of it. You don't want that. What you want to do is have the knife at sort of about 90 degrees, or even sort of at a sort of acute angle, and just sort of drag down the model. And what that'll do is, you can see it sort of made a shiny patch where I've been doing that, and that will actually scrape off thin bits of metal, like sort of literally just sort of shavings of metal. And you can see there I've now got a nice shiny patch where I've done that, and then that will leave a smooth patch. So there's a bit I cut off earlier here, so we can do the same there and sort of leave a smooth patch. And it takes a while to get used to at first, but you'll begin to feel through the knife whether you've actually smoothed out the surface or not. You can feel sort of a rough surface versus a smooth surface, and you'll begin to sort of pick up on sort of the imperfections and the mould lines sort of as you're scraping. To be honest, this guy's really actually quite good. I'm going to leave him as is for the moment. A little bit down there, but yeah, again, nothing major. So that's the body done, essentially. So we'll quickly move on to the leg. So again, as I said, this is a pretty chunky bit of metal on the bottom of his foot here. This is obviously sort of where he was connected to the foot sprue, so he was probably sort of like connected on like that or something on those lines. So I'm going to get the clippers in for that. You don't want to try and do that with a knife, or you will embed a knife into yourself, and that's never fun. So I'm just going to clip that off. And again, with these kind of cutters, you can get quite close in. So I've managed to sort of cut that off pretty close in to the bottom of the foot. And again, this is the bottom of the foot. So whether you want to be worrying too much about sort of whether that's incredibly smooth or not is up to you. Again, what I'll probably be doing is just sort of coming in here and just sort of giving it a quick file, just to make sure that it's at least sort of perpendicular with the rest of the foot, so that when I glue it onto the base, I'm not going to have an issue with bits sticking out. So I think, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that, to be honest. There's nothing else major on there, I don't think. As I said, these are really good models. They've been well sculpted. They're obviously out of new moulds, because there just aren't any mould lines on there. As the mould ages, it begins to sort of shrink or crack, or sort of things like that, and you'll begin to get worse and worse mould lines, and eventually the mould will get to a point where the manufacturer will just say, yeah, you know what, that's dead, we'll make a new mould. So a little bit on the knee there. Okay, so onto this one. So this one is still, because the parts are quite small, they've left it on the gate, and this is essentially scrap metal. This is sort of how the miniature is cast. Sort of when the metal's poured in, it fills up all these vents and sort of goes into the actual part of the model, and these remain connected. So we're just going to go in, clip them off. So here it's going to be down to sort of looking at how the model is put together to work out what's part of the model and what's part of the sprue. So here, I mean, this is quite obviously a magazine for the gun. Looks a bit AK-ish, so I'm going to clip off. I'm quite happy to sort of clip off quite close to that. So there we go. And again here, it's at his elbow, and there doesn't appear to be sort of any reason for anything to be sticking out of his elbow. So I'm just going to clip that off quite close as well. And these bits of metal, there's not a huge amount you can do with them. I believe if you're casting your own metal miniatures, you can actually melt this stuff down and reuse it. The little tags that you get on the bottom of the miniatures, like these sort of things that fit into these sort of slotted bases, these can be quite useful because you can cut them up into smaller pieces and put them into your paint to help sort of mix it up. It's sort of an agitator in the paint, essentially. At least that's what I do with mine. So now that we've got the worst of that off, there's what looks like a little bit just kind of sticking out the end of the magazine there. So we're just going to take that off. There's a bit on the bottom of the gun there. There's a little bit on the sights. Now that could be part of the sight. That it's kind of difficult to say really. I would personally say that's not that little top bit sticking out there. So I'm going to take that off about there. Again, there's another bit on the back of the gun. I'm going to take that off a bit better, just to make life a bit easier for me. So there we go. And it looks like there's possibly a bit on the top of the shoulder there. So I think that's all the clipping that needs doing. Now we're on to clean up. I'm going to move the light in. Let's see, there we go. So clean up. So the clippers will have done a fairly good job, but you'll see that there's still going to be bits that you'll have to sort of chop off by hand. And again, this is very much a case of sharp knife, but be very, very careful when you're doing it. Ideally, like I'm doing here, try and keep a piece of the model sort of in the way of the knife and your finger, if you can. Otherwise you're just going to have to take it really, really, really gently and be very, very careful, because you do not want this knife embedded in your finger. Obviously the sharper the blades you've got, the better. Always a bit strange, that one, but it works because you have to put less pressure on the knife to actually cut through something, and the less pressure you're putting on, sort of the less distance you're going to go after the cut. So that's what you want to be avoiding. So again, here I've managed to cut it down to sort of pretty much where it needs to be. So I'm going to come in and sort of scrape off that bit, smooth it out. I can still feel there's a little bit of a, there we go, that's better. So that's that. There's a little bit on the end of the rifle there. Now what I've found so far with building the miniatures is that the guns tend to be sort of the worst offenders for having mould lines on, and the mould lines will run essentially it's a seam between the two halves of the mould when the item is cast, and you can usually tell fairly easily where those mould lines are going to be purely by sort of the shape of the object. It's going to be along the sort of the longest part of the model usually, so you're not going to cast it there because it's going to be too difficult to pull out these bits, all these sticking out bits. Looking along it that way, you can see there's very little that way and that way to actually interfere with pulling the piece out of the mould. So the mould lines are going to be around there and around there, which means that they're going to be sort of along the top and the bottom of the gun. So I'm just going to give these a bit of a scrape, just to sort of clear off any that are there. On the arms, they will be along the arms, depending on the way the model's cast. Sometimes they'll actually curve the mould to fit them, to sort of fit the arm. Other times they won't. It just depends on sort of the caster. There's obviously sort of this remaining gate on his elbow, and I can feel that quite distinctly under there, so there's a little bit is going to need clearing off in there, just to smooth that out. You can also come back in with files and things like that if you want to, sort of needle files if you want to try and clear out. Now I think there is a bit of a mould line running across there. I don't know if that's going to come up on camera. There we go. So yeah, so there you go. So across the top there you can just see there's that sort of lighter line. That's the edge of a mould line. So what I'm going to do is just come in and scrape that away. If you've got a piece that is sort of curved like this, you want to sort of work around it. So because if you scrape it straight with a straight blade, you're going to end up with a flat surface, and that's going to look strange. So what you want to do is try and sort of, as you're scraping it, curve the piece so that you keep that curved shape. Now this seems to have worked okay. What you will find is on the shiny bit that you've just created, if it's a really bad mould line, the sort of major difference between the two heights is you'll find you've got a shiny bit and then a gap and then another shiny bit, and what that gap is where the mould line is stopping the blade from touching the metal. So you want to kind of try and keep on scraping until you've just got one solid shiny bit across the entire area where the mould line was, and that means the mould line's gone. So I'm fairly happy with the way that is. I don't think there's anything else really needs doing to that, so we'll put that to one side, and all that remains is his arm. So again, same job, just going to clip that off a bit better, and this is dangerous, don't do this. I'm cutting straight into my finger here. I've had years of practice and years of injuries. Learned from my mistakes. So again, there's another mould line. It's quite a bad mould line actually, running down here. Well, I say bad for these miniatures more than anything else. It's kind of running across there. Again, sort of look at the top and the bottom. That's not going to be the way it was cast, top and bottom. That's going to be the way it was cast because there's less detail. And again, there's little bits here and there, and I think that is, oh, there's a gate in there. You'll also find that any vents or gates and things like that tend to be along the line of the mould line as well. It's just because that's the easiest way of sort of creating them when they make the mould. So remember, you don't want to be digging in like this because that will take a chunk out of the metal. You just want to be sort of scraping at a sort of 90-degree or even acute angle, and that will get rid of the mould lines for you. So now we have these 4 pieces. The next job is to clean them up. When a miniature is moulded, it gets coated. The mould gets coated in what they call mould release, and that is essentially a greasy type stuff which ends up on the miniature and can cause primers to not stick, paint to not stick, even glue to not stick. So you want to, I don't know if it's going to come up, but there's a faint yellow sort of in this area. There's a sort of faint yellow cast to it, and that's actually sort of part of the mould remover. It's also just sort of general skankiness on the model, but it's also part of the mould remover. So what we do now, or what I do now anyway, is I've got a small container here with just water and a bit of washing up liquid or sort of hand soap or some kind of sort of soapy substance. So, and it's just a warm water, or at least it was. So we're just going to drop those in. So I'm going to try and do this on camera, it's not going to be easy. So essentially it is literally just take an old toothbrush and scrub the model, and that's essentially it. So once it's scrubbed, give it a rinse in some clean water, not with any dish soap or anything like that, and you'll find that the miniature will actually feel different. It'll feel almost cleaner in a way. And then I just get a piece of tissue paper and just lay them out to dry. Normally I will leave them for several hours, usually overnight, to dry out completely. You can speed the process up with a hairdryer, but that can leave sort of limescale and things like that on the miniature, which isn't ideal. So what I've done, I'll leave that off to one side, and essentially you do all the bits like that. So what I've got is one that I prepared earlier in traditional Blue Peter fashion. So hopefully this is basically sort of pretty much the same guy. So legs missing, he's got 2 arms, etc, etc. So now we're on to building the miniature. For this I'm going to be using superglue and a knife. There may be pinning involved, at which point in time you can use a pin vise with a very small drill bit and lengths of metal of varying widths or thicknesses in this case. People have used staples or sort of other sort of thin lengths of metal, and as long as you've got the right drill bit in a pin vise and you go carefully, it's not particularly difficult to do. I don't think I'll need to demonstrate it on this model, but I may do a video on pinning later on. So this is the glue that I use. It's by Deluxe Materials. Yeah, Deluxe Materials. They produce 3 different types of glue. This is the middle glue, the medium viscosity, and you can see sort of in the pot it's kind of sticky, a little bit sticky, but kind of flows okay. They also produce this is their hot glue, which is super thin, and you can see it's almost water. I don't tend to use this very much, so little in fact that the label's peeling off. The third one they produce is the much thicker version of this and will barely flow at all. I just prefer this because it sticks well, bonds in 5 to 10 seconds, so you don't have to worry about sitting there and holding the piece for absolutely ages before it dries, and it's just thick enough that you can kind of gloop a bit onto a piece and then sort of jam them together. With the really thin stuff, it can be a complete nightmare because you're sort of it just goes everywhere. You tend to need to use sort of professional applicators like syringes and things like that for that. So what we've got is we've got 2 arms, a leg and a body. So what we'll start with is we'll start with the leg. So you can see in there what you've got is you've got where the leg needs to be, and then there's this sort of block in the middle that matches up with a, where is it? There it is. So it matches up with a corresponding hole in the leg. So if I can get some focus, thank you. So it matches up with a hole in the leg, and what that does is it just provides extra surface area for the glue to adhere to. It's very useful. So remembering to get the leg the right way around, obviously, we can just dry fit it in there and see how it goes together, noticing sort of what parts of the model are going to actually be touching. And you'll find that on this particular one, all the way down his leg is actually touching onto the cloak at the back there. That's very useful. That means we've got a huge surface area. So if you can see down there, it's going to be touching all the way down the back of his leg. That's an enormous surface area to glue, which is great. The more surface area the better. The more surface area the stronger the join will be, especially with glue. Now this isn't fitting great. There's a gap in there and it kind of wobbles a bit, which usually indicates that either the hole's too small or the block's too big. In this case, I think it's not too bad. I've come across a lot worse, so I think probably I'm going to leave that as it is. So what I tend to do next is just give the surface a bit of a key, a bit of a sort of bit of definition for the glue to catch onto, and the way I do that is I just slash it with a knife essentially. Again, be careful with the knife, it's sharp, etc, etc. So if you can see in there, what I've done is just scratched up the surface, and that just gives the glue something to really sort of grip onto and hold onto. So I'll do the same with the leg. So in this case, sort of I can go all the way down. You don't have to go deep. I mean, I'm not putting much pressure on it. It would certainly be enough to cut my finger, but you know, sort of I'm not really sort of trying to gouge into the metal or anything like that. I'm just looking to sort of put just a sort of slight roughness on there essentially, and a little bit on the end there as well. So there we go. So next up is the glue, which has glued itself shut, of course. These pots have a sort of very thin hole at the end, end of a sort of fairly half decent pipe, and you do tend to get glue gunked around the edge there, but yeah, it's super glue, you just have to kind of go with it. So get a little bit and just sort of dab it along the top there, and essentially sort of you want to put a little bit of glue anywhere where the two parts are going to touch, and then put them together, get them in the right place, and just hold them in position. This is where you get quite used to having your fingers in strange sort of configurations whilst you're trying to hold pieces together. In this case, because there's such a huge surface area and the pieces go together reasonably nicely, that should just about do it. So there we go. So that is the leg in position. You can see there's a bit of a gap down there, just sort of down the bottom there. That's not ideal, but we can live with that. Inside's all right, not too bad. I mean, if it's a problem, I mean, these obviously aren't going to be sort of competition winning paint jobs or anything like that. It's been a very long time since I've done a competition winning paint job, but you can do gap filling with green stuff and things like that. So that's essentially it. That's the process. It's going to get repeated on the arms. Obviously, you just kind of figure out sort of which side the arms go on and sort of where they go. So in this case, if you look at the thing and sort of match it up, it looks like he's actually sort of holding his gun up in the air a bit like that. And this side, he's got, it looks like it's going to be sort of down like that maybe. It's difficult to tell. Let's see if we can see from the back a bit better. So, he's actually holding it forwards, so he's actually pointing it forward in this case. And what you'll find is that with these miniatures, they're actually really good. There'll be a position where everything just kind of fits together. Obviously, sort of looking at the box will help determine sort of what pose they're supposed to be in and get you close to where it needs to be. But this video is already about half an hour long, so I'm not going to bore you with sticking the two arms on. Suffice it to say that sort of it's exactly the same process. Scratch up the two surfaces, bit of glue, stick them together. With what you will find is with arms like this, where there is a small contact point between the two arms and it sticks out quite a lot, you're going to find that during play that'll happen. Because the contact area is so small and it's quite a distance away from the point where you're likely to be sort of knocking the model on a regular basis, and it will snap that joint, and that's where pinning comes in. Pinning helps give extra strength to the joint because it gives you more surface area through the joint, and it also gives an extra it's a bit like putting a rebar in concrete. It's sort of that sort of strength in concrete. It's a sort of similar kind of thing, similar kind of idea. But for the moment, that'll do, I think. So there we go. That's essentially how to sort of clean up from scratch, sort of clean up a miniature, wash it down, get all the mould release off, and glue it together. So cheers guys, and I'll see you later.